Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and drift back through centuries to a single day in ancient Rome. Not a day of conquest or coronation, but an ordinary morning when bakers lit their ovens, when children ran through marble streets still warm from yesterday's sun, when the empire stood tall and eternal, and no one yet knew that eternity had an ending. Here, in this space between past and present, we walk together through a world that believed it would last forever. We smell fresh bread from corner bakeries where freedmen and patricians waited side by side. We hear the splash of fountains fed by aqueducts stretching across miles of countryside. We watch senators in togas debating in the forum while slaves carried water jugs on their shoulders, both sharing the same dusty roads, the same summer heat, the same city that sprawled across 7 hills. We imagine the bathhouse attendants preparing hot rooms for afternoon crowds, the street vendors calling out their wares, the temple priestesses tending eternal flames that everyone assumed would never die. Each episode here isn't just about emperors and legions. It's not about memorizing battle dates or tracing the fall of empires in textbooks. It's about the lives lived. The schoolboy scratching Latin grammar onto wax tablets, the grandmother telling stories her own grandmother told her, the merchant calculating profits while his ship sailed toward Ostia. It's about a civilization so confident in forever that it never thought to write down the small, quiet things that made it real, the daily rhythms that created an empire. If you enjoy these journeys into the forgotten hours of history, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. Imagine waking up in Rome on a morning in late summer, 409 years after the birth of Christ, when the city still believed itself eternal. The sun rises over the 7 hills the way it has for 1,000 years, casting long golden light across marble temples that have stood longer than any living memory. The air smells of baking bread, of olive oil heating in clay lamps, of the Tiber River winding through the valley below. Somewhere in the distance a rooster crows. A wooden cart rattles over ancient cobblestones, and the sound echoes off walls built by men whose names have been forgotten for centuries. This is not a day of battles or emperors. This is not a day that history will remember with dates and monuments. This is simply a day, one of thousands stretching back to when Romulus first drew a line in the dirt and called it sacred. But this day, this ordinary, unremarkable morning sits, perched on the edge of something no Roman can see coming. Within a year, the Visigoths will be at the gates. Within 2 years, the Eternal City will burn. Within a generation, the Western Empire will be a memory, its roads crumbling, its aqueducts dry. But this morning, none of that has happened yet. This morning, Rome is still Rome, and the people who walk its streets believe it will stand forever. What makes this moment so haunting is not what happens, but what doesn't. There are no omens in the sky, no prophets crying doom in the forum. There is only the ordinary rhythm of life. A mother wakes her children. A slave draws water from a fountain. A merchant opens his shop and arranges his wares in the soft morning light. A senator walks toward the curia, his toga draped just so, thinking about grain shipments and tax revenue and the tedious politics of a peaceful empire. Somewhere in the residential districts, in the crowded apartment blocks called insulae, a family shares breakfast, dipping bread into watered wine, the same breakfast their great-grandparents ate. The children don't know they are living at the end of an age. The parents don't know that the world their children inherit will be unrecognizable. This is the Rome that archaeology struggles to capture. We have their triumphal arches and colosseums, their emperors' faces carved in stone. We have treaties and battle accounts, the official record of power. But the bread, the laughter, the small frustrations of a door that sticks, a sandal that needs repair, these vanish like smoke. Yet here and there, if you know where to look, the ordinary persists. A piece of graffiti scratched into a wall, a shopping list on a broken piece of pottery, a letter never sent preserved by accident, a child's toy found in the ruins of a bathhouse. These fragments let us glimpse something more precious than empire. They let us see the daily texture of human life, the moments that felt too small to record but were everything that mattered. On this particular morning, as the sun climbs higher and the streets fill with noise, Rome is simply being Rome. It is cooking and cleaning and buying and selling. It is arguing and laughing and falling in love. It is raising children and burying parents and making plans for next week, next year, the next decade. It is doing what every city does, building tomorrow on the foundation of yesterday, assuming the pattern will continue forever. But time is not interested in what we assume, and this ordinary morning, so much like every other morning, is actually something else entirely. It is one of the last mornings, one of the final chapters in a story so long that no single person could have read it from beginning to end. One of the closing heartbeats of a civilization that believed it would never die. The Romans didn't know they were living through an ending. How could they? Endings rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as ordinary days, as normal mornings, as the familiar rhythm of life continuing exactly as it always has. Until suddenly it doesn't. This is the story of that morning. This is the story of a day in ancient Rome, before the empire fell. Rome in the early 5th century is a city of contradictions, a place where the past weighs so heavily that the present can barely move beneath it. The population has shrunk from its height of perhaps 1 million souls to somewhere closer to 600,000 or 700,000, though no one counts anymore with the precision they once did. The grand forums and temples still stand, magnificent and proud, but between them, neighbourhoods have grown shabby. Buildings that once housed senators now shelter a dozen families, their marble facades blackened by centuries of cooking fires, their courtyards filled with laundry lines and chicken coops. Still, the city is vast beyond anything else in the Western world. Constantinople may rival it now in wealth and power, but Rome remains Rome, the mother city, the place where every road still leads. Its walls, rebuilt and strengthened by Aurelian over a century ago, stretch for 12 miles around the 7 hills, enclosing a landscape of temples and tenements, of palatial villas and cramped workshops, of public grandeur and private poverty existing side by side. The Tiber moves through it all, brown and slow, carrying barges from Ostia laden with grain from Africa, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain. The river is the city's lifeline, though it floods with frustrating regularity, sending families scrambling to upper floors while the streets turn to brown rivers and the smell of sewage fills the air for days. When it recedes, life returns to normal. It always has. In the centre of things, the ancient heart still beats. The Forum Romanum, where Cicero once spoke and Julius Caesar fell, remains the ceremonial core of Roman identity, though real power has long since moved elsewhere. The great basilicas stand open to the sky, their columns casting shadows that sweep across the paving stones like the hands of an enormous clock. Senators still gather, still debate, still vote on matters of grain distribution and public works, performing the rituals of republican government, even though everyone knows the real decisions are made in Ravenna, where the Emperor Honorius sits safely behind marshes and walls, far from the vulnerability of Rome itself. The Palatine Hill rises above the Forum, crowned with the sprawling palaces of emperors past. Some are still maintained, still occupied by court officials and bureaucrats. Others have fallen into elegant decay, their gardens wild, their fountains dry. It costs too much to maintain everything, and the money that once flowed so freely to Rome now flows to other places, to other priorities. The empire is contracting, pulling in on itself, and Rome, the eternal city, is slowly being left behind. But in the streets, in the markets, in the bathhouses and taverns, life continues with a resilience that is itself a kind of eternity. The bakeries open before dawn, their ovens heating, their bakers kneading dough with the same motions their ancestors used. The public fountains run clear and cold, fed by aqueducts that have carried water for centuries, engineering marvels so reliable that people no longer marvel at them. The bathhouses fill in the afternoon with citizens of every class, rich and poor mixing in the steam, their bodies made temporarily equal by nakedness and heat. The insulae, the great apartment blocks that house the majority of the population, rise 5 and 6 stories high, their upper floors precarious and cramped, their ground floors often housing shops and taverns. They are fire traps, everyone knows this, and every few years one goes up in flames, killing dozens. But there is nowhere else to live, and so people take their chances, cooking on small braziers, lighting lamps, and praying to household gods for protection. Religion in Rome has become complicated. The old gods are still honoured, their temples still standing, though the priests who tend them are fewer and older each year. Christianity has been the official faith of the empire for nearly a century, and churches have risen throughout the city, often built over or beside pagan temples in a landscape of competing eternities. Some families hedge their bets, making offerings to both Christ and Jupiter, unsure which power will prove more reliable when the chips are down. The aristocracy, the great senatorial families whose lineages stretch back centuries, still inhabit their sprawling villas on the hills, still maintain libraries and gardens, still educate their sons in Greek and Latin rhetoric. They live in a world increasingly disconnected from the one beyond their gates, a world of classical learning and refined leisure that feels more and more like a beautiful performance with no audience. They write poetry, debate philosophy, collect art, and try not to notice that the empire their ancestors built is slowly coming apart at the seams. Beyond the walls, the countryside tells a different story. Villas abandoned, fields returning to forest, roads falling into disrepair, bandits and barbarian settlers moving into the vacuum where Roman authority used to be. But inside the walls, surrounded by the accumulated weight of 1,000 years, it is easy to believe that nothing fundamental has changed, that Rome is still the centre of everything that matters. The year is 410. In Ravenna, the Emperor Honorius breeds chickens and avoids hard decisions. In the north, a Visigothic king named Alaric is moving his people south, having been betrayed one too many times by Roman promises. His army is hungry, his people are desperate, and Rome, rich, vulnerable Rome, lies ahead like an overripe fruit waiting to be picked. But this morning, in the city itself, none of that feels real yet. This morning the sun is warm, the bread is fresh, and the aqueducts still run. This morning is just another morning, ordinary and eternal, in a city that has always been and surely will always be. The voices of ordinary Romans should have disappeared completely, lost to the accidents of time and the priorities of memory. For centuries, historians had only the official record, the speeches of senators, the chronicles of emperors, the monuments raised to commemorate victories and gods. The daily life of the baker, the merchant, the mother, the child, these existed only as shadows, as extras in someone else's grand drama. The common people of Rome left no memoirs, commissioned no statues, inspired no epic poetry. When they died, they were burned or buried in unmarked graves, and the world moved on without recording their names. But stone is more honest than memory. Stone remembers everything carved into its surface, everything scratched, everything painted, everything written in a moment of boredom or anger or love. And Rome is a city made of stone. The discovery began in fragments in the 19th century, when archaeologists started paying attention to things they'd previously ignored. A piece of graffiti on the wall of a bathhouse, the drawing of a gladiator and a crude joke about his performance, an inscription in a bakery recording the price of bread on a particular day, a shopping list scratched into a broken piece of pottery used as scrap paper, a love letter never delivered, preserved by chance in the dry conditions of a collapsed building. These weren't the grand historical artifacts that museums fought over. They were trash, essentially, the ephemera of daily life that survived only by accident. But as more were found, as scholars began to collect and study them, a different Rome began to emerge, a Rome of real people living real lives, dealing with the same mundane concerns that occupy people in any age. The Vindolanda tablets, though found far from Rome itself on Hadrian's Wall in Britain, opened everyone's eyes to what was possible. Thin sheets of wood preserved in waterlogged soil, bearing letters written by soldiers and their families, complaining about the weather, asking for more socks, gossiping about their commanders. They were so ordinary, so immediately human, that they transformed how historians thought about the Roman world. If such intimate records could survive on the edge of empire, what might still be hidden in Rome itself? The Forum, when excavated properly, proved to be layered with such voices. Graffiti-covered walls that had later been built over, preserving election slogans from the Republic, declarations of love from the Empire, crude insults aimed at unpopular officials. One wall, when carefully uncovered, revealed a tally of days marked by someone, a slave perhaps, counting down to freedom or simply marking time in the only way available. The insulas, when their ruins were finally examined with care, held countless small artifacts, broken pottery bearing names and notes, coins dropped between floorboards, children's toys, dice carved from bone, hairpins, needles, the tools and tokens of everyday existence, each one representing a moment, a person, a life that official history never bothered to record. Most precious of all were the letters, written on papyrus or wax tablets, sometimes surviving in the strangest places. A complaint to a landlord about a leaking roof, an invitation to dinner, a father writing to his son, admonishing him to study harder, a woman writing to her sister about the difficulty of finding good help, a merchant keeping accounts, recording debts owed and payments made, the mundane arithmetic of survival. What made these discoveries revolutionary was not their individual content but their cumulative effect. Each small voice, added to all the others, created a chorus, a soundscape of Roman life that had been silent for 1,500 years. Historians could finally ask not just what happened in Rome, but what it felt like to live there, to wake up there, to raise children and grow old there. The texture of daily existence, previously invisible, became suddenly, startlingly real. Modern archaeology has continued the work with even more sophisticated tools. Ground-penetrating radar reveals the layouts of buildings never fully excavated. Chemical analysis of soil shows what people ate, what animals they kept, what happened in particular rooms. DNA extracted from teeth and bones tells stories of migration and family. Pollen preserved in ancient drains reveals what flowers bloomed in Roman gardens. Every technique adds another layer of detail, another voice to the chorus. Perhaps most moving are the inscriptions on tombstones, not of emperors or generals, but of ordinary people, a husband remembering his wife of 40 years, a mother mourning a child who lived only 3 days, a freed slave recording his gratitude to the master who liberated him, a young soldier buried far from home, his tombstone noting that he was 22 years old and loved by his comrades. These voices speak across the centuries with an intimacy that no official history can match. The graffiti, though, remains the most startling, precisely because it was never meant to survive. Someone in the 2nd century wrote, "Lucius was here," on the wall of a tavern, and now, 2,000 years later, we know that Lucius existed, that he drank in that particular place, that he felt moved to leave his mark. Someone else wrote, "I don't like Octavian, he's a thief," and that small grudge, that moment of frustration outlasted the empire itself. These discoveries changed everything. Before them, Rome was monuments and wars, a story of great men and grand events. After them, Rome became a city of bakers and their ovens, of children playing in the streets, of merchants haggling over prices, of servants gossiping about their masters, of ordinary people living ordinary lives in the shadow of history. The voices were there all along, carved in stone, written in ash, buried in the layers of time. We just had to learn how to listen. The first archaeologists to encounter Roman graffiti didn't know what to make of it. They were men of the 19th century, trained in classical languages and raised on the high literature of Rome, the polished prose of Cicero, the epic poetry of Virgil, the measured histories of Livy and Tacitus. They came to Rome expecting grandeur, and they found it in abundance, temples and triumphal arches, statues and inscriptions honouring emperors and gods. These were the remnants they understood, the remnants that fit their image of Rome as a civilization of marble dignity and noble purpose. But then, on a wall in Pompeii, someone found a crude drawing of a phallus with an arrow pointing toward a brothel. Nearby, scrawled in hasty Latin, a message that translated roughly to "Gaius was here and had a good time." Below that, another hand had added, "Gaius lies, the wine was terrible." Further down, someone had written an insult so obscene that the first translator blushed and refused to publish it. This was not the Rome of the history books. This was something else entirely. Early scholars didn't quite know how to categorize these findings. They were clearly Roman, dating to the 1st century, preserved by the volcanic ash that buried Pompeii in 79. But they were so, well, undignified, so common, so embarrassingly human. Some suggested they should be documented but not displayed, kept in private collections where they wouldn't offend sensitive viewers. Others argued they were invaluable precisely because they were unfiltered, the raw voice of Rome without the polish of literature or the propaganda of power. The debate intensified as more graffiti was uncovered, not just in Pompeii but throughout the Roman world. Election slogans appeared on walls in Herculaneum. Love declarations, some sweet, some explicit, covered the walls of bathhouses. Merchants advertised their wares in painted letters 3 feet high. Gladiator fans had carved their favourite fighters' names into the stone benches of amphitheatres, adding tallies of victories and sometimes sketches of combat scenes. What gradually dawned on the archaeological community was that they'd stumbled onto something no ancient text could provide: the unguarded voice of ordinary people. These weren't carefully composed letters meant for posterity. They weren't speeches polished for public consumption. They were spontaneous, raw, honest. The Roman equivalent of bathroom stall graffiti and social media posts. Immediate expressions of thought and feeling with no expectation that anyone centuries later would care. Dr. Heinrich Schreiber, a German archaeologist working in Rome in 1867, was among the first to recognise the historical value of what others dismissed as mere vandalism. He began cataloguing every piece of graffiti he found, no matter how crude or trivial. His colleagues thought him eccentric at best, obsessed with garbage at worst. But Schreiber understood something crucial, that these voices, precisely because they were unconsidered and unimportant, told a truth that official records could never convey. He published his findings in a thick volume titled Voices of the Roman Street, and though it was largely ignored by academic institutions, it caught the attention of a few forward-thinking scholars who realised Schreiber was onto something. If you wanted to understand what Romans actually thought, not what emperors wanted them to think, you had to look at the walls. The graffiti revealed patterns that surprised everyone. Political engagement, for instance, seemed far more widespread than anyone had assumed. Walls were covered with election endorsements, some earnest. Vote for Marcus, he's honest. Some sarcastic. Vote for Quintus if you enjoy being robbed. Citizens argued about public works, about taxes, about the quality of the games. Democracy might have been dead, but public opinion was very much alive, scrawled on every available surface. Love and sex were constant themes, as they are in every human society, but the frankness was startling. Men and women declared their affections publicly, sometimes tenderly. Flora, you are my light, sometimes desperately. Please, Julia, meet me at the fountain. I cannot bear another day without seeing you. There were boasts, complaints, crude propositions, and occasionally touchingly expressions of genuine devotion that transcended the centuries. Religious sentiment appeared too, not the formal prayers of temples, but personal appeals. Mercury, help me win at dice. Venus, make him love me. Jupiter, protect my son in Gaul. These were the prayers of people who needed the gods to be real, to be present, to care about the small, desperate hopes of ordinary lives, and everywhere, the mundane business of existence. Notices about lost dogs, complaints about noisy neighbours, arguments about debts, advertisements for rooms to rent. Someone had written, "If anyone finds a copper cooking pot, return to the Tavern of Tertius, reward offered." Someone else had responded below, "I found it, Tertius is a cheapskate. Reward was 3 coins. Below that, in different handwriting, Tertius waters his wine. What these early archaeologists slowly realised was that graffiti was Rome's collective diary, an unintentional archive of daily life written by people who never imagined anyone would care what they thought. It was history from below, intimate and chaotic and utterly authentic. The reaction in academic circles was gradual acceptance mixed with ongoing discomfort. Yes, these inscriptions were historically valuable, but did they really need to display the obscene ones in museums? Should textbooks include the crude jokes and explicit propositions? There was a tension between scholarly thoroughness and Victorian sensibility that took decades to resolve. But eventually scholarship won. The walls of Rome and its empire were recognised as historical documents of the first importance, giving voice to the voiceless and texture to a past that had previously been too smooth, too clean, too focused on the powerful. The Romans, it turned out, were not marble statues. They were people, messy and complicated and wonderfully, recognisably human. The walls had been talking all along. We just needed to learn their language. Rome presented itself as eternal, but its people lived one day at a time. This was the contradiction at the heart of Roman life, the vast gap between the city's monumental self-image and the daily scramble for survival that occupied most of its inhabitants. The emperors built triumphal arches that touched the sky. The people worried about where their next meal would come from. The state proclaimed dominion over the known world. The citizens wondered if the aqueduct would keep running, or if they'd have to haul water from the river again. The architecture itself embodied this split reality. The Forum Romanum, the Colosseum, the Pantheon. These structures were built to last forever, constructed from materials and techniques designed to outlive empires. And they did. They stand even now, monuments to Roman engineering and ambition. But the insulae where most Romans lived were built as cheaply as possible, timber frames and brick, often shoddily constructed, prone to collapse and fire. They were meant to last a generation, maybe two, before being torn down and rebuilt. One world was permanent, the other was disposable. The same contrast marked every aspect of life. The wealthy inhabited palatial villas with mosaic floors, painted walls, private bathhouses and gardens that recreated paradise. They dined on imported delicacies, wore silk from China, collected Greek sculptures, and spent their afternoons debating philosophy. They lived in the Rome of imagination, the eternal city of culture and refinement. The poor, the vast majority, lived in cramped apartments that smelled of cooking fires and unwashed bodies. They ate bread and porridge, occasionally flavoured with cheap oil or a bit of salted fish. They wore wool tunics that they patched and repatched until the original fabric was more whole than cloth. They worked from dawn until dusk, and then they slept, and then they did it again, day after day, year after year. They lived in the Rome of survival. Even the food supply illustrated the contradiction. Rome imported grain from Egypt and Africa on a staggering scale, hundreds of thousands of tons annually, distributed free or at subsidized prices to citizens to keep them fed and quiet. It was a triumph of logistics, a supply chain spanning the Mediterranean, dependent on favorable winds and stable governance, and the continued cooperation of distant provinces. When it worked, it was magnificent. Proof of Rome's ability to organize and sustain a population far larger than the local agriculture could support. But when it didn't work, when ships were delayed or provinces rebelled or money ran short, the city panicked. Bread riots had toppled governments before. The mob could turn dangerous when their stomachs were empty. So emperors, even weak emperors, even emperors whose authority barely extended beyond Italy, made sure the grain ships kept coming. It was the first rule of Roman politics: keep the people fed or face the consequences. The wealthy, of course, were insulated from such concerns. They had their own estates, their own supplies, their own networks of patronage and privilege. If the grain dole failed, it wouldn't touch them. They might notice the tension in the streets, might hear reports of unrest, but they wouldn't go hungry. The eternal Rome of marble and literature was their Rome, secure and unchanging. For everyone else, eternity was a myth. They lived in a Rome of constant precariousness, where illness meant destitution, where fire could destroy everything you owned in an hour, where the landlord might evict you on a whim, where the grain ships might not come. Their Rome was temporary, contingent, balanced on the edge of disaster. Yet the state continued to invest in monuments, another triumphal arch for an emperor who'd never won a battle, another temple to a god who seemed increasingly distant, another palace on the Palatine, grander than the last, proof of power and permanence even as the foundations crumbled. The contradiction was built into the city's stones, grandeur rising above poverty, eternity erected on the backs of people who couldn't see beyond next week. The bathhouses represented perhaps the strangest intersection of these two realities. They were public, open to everyone for a small fee, spaces where slave and senator might share the same pool, the same steam, the same momentary escape from the hierarchies that governed everything else. The buildings themselves were magnificent, vast complexes of heated pools and cold plunges, exercise yards and libraries, decorated with marble and mosaics that rivaled any private villa. Here, for a few hours, ordinary Romans could inhabit the eternal city, could experience luxury, could feel like they belonged to the Rome of monuments and glory. Then they dried off, put on their patched tunics, and went back to their cramped apartments and uncertain futures. The contradiction was everywhere, inescapable, woven into the fabric of daily life. Scholars who study this period often focus on the political and military decline, the barbarian invasions, the division of the empire. But the real story might be this fundamental tension, this impossible attempt to maintain an image of eternity, while most of the population lived hand to mouth. Rome proclaimed itself eternal, but it fed its people on grain that had to be shipped from across the sea. Rome built monuments to last millennia, but its citizens lived in fire traps. Rome conquered the world, but it couldn't guarantee its own people a decent place to sleep. This contradiction didn't cause the fall of Rome exactly, but it created a fragility, a brittleness beneath the marble facade. The city looked solid, permanent, invincible, but it was held together by logistics and luck and the daily scramble of millions of people just trying to get by. And when the logistics failed, when the luck ran out, when the grain ships stopped coming and the government stopped caring, the contradiction couldn't hold anymore. The empire was marble, but its people were bread, and bread, unlike marble, doesn't last forever. Historians have never agreed on what it actually meant to be an ordinary Roman. The debate has raged for generations, fueled by incomplete evidence and modern assumptions that may or may not apply to an ancient world. Some scholars argue that Roman life, despite its hierarchies and inequalities, offered a kind of stability and order that most people found preferable to the chaos that followed the empire's fall. Others insist that daily existence for the majority was brutal, precarious, and shot through with exploitation and violence. Both sides marshal evidence, both sides claim authority, and the truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in the contested middle. The optimistic view emerged first, particularly among 19th century scholars who saw Rome as the foundation of Western civilization. They emphasized the public works, the aqueducts bringing clean water, the roads connecting distant provinces, the bathhouses offering luxury to all classes. They pointed to the grain dole, the free or subsidized food that kept hundreds of thousands fed. They noted the public entertainment, the games and races and theatrical performances that filled leisure hours. They argued that Roman citizenship, even for the poor, conferred rights and protections unknown in the barbarian territories beyond the frontier. In this interpretation, Rome was a kind of ancient welfare state, imperfect certainly, but providing its people with amenities that wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. The poor might have lived in cramped quarters, but they had access to running water, public sanitation, education in basic literacy, entertainment, and the rule of law. They were part of something larger than themselves, connected to a civilization that spanned from Britain to Mesopotamia. Their lives, while hard, had meaning and structure. The pessimistic counter-argument came later, as historians began looking more critically at the evidence and asking whose perspective the ancient sources represented. Yes, Rome had aqueducts, but most people couldn't afford the private connections that brought water directly to their homes. They hauled it from public fountains, often waiting in long lines. Yes, there was free grain, but it was distributed only to male citizens, excluding women, children, slaves, and the huge population of immigrants and freedmen who made up much of the city. Yes, there were bathhouses, but they charged, fees that the truly poor often couldn't afford. Moreover, this view emphasized the grinding poverty was real and widespread. Families crowded into single rooms with no privacy, no light, no heat except from dangerous braziers. Disease was rampant, life expectancy short. Infant mortality was staggering. Perhaps half of all children died before age 5. Work was back-breaking and unrelenting. Legal protections existed on paper, but were accessible mainly to those who could afford advocates and knew how to navigate the system. For the majority, life was nasty, brutish and short, only slightly ameliorated by the empire's public amenities. A third school of thought, more recent, tries to synthesize these views by acknowledging that Roman society was too complex for simple judgments. Life varied enormously depending on your status, your occupation, your location within the city, your family connections. A skilled craftsman with steady work and a reasonable landlord might live quite comfortably, enjoying genuine leisure and cultural participation. A day labourer with no stable employment, living in a 6th-floor walk-up that could collapse or burn at any moment, experienced Rome very differently. This nuanced approach looks at individual circumstances rather than sweeping generalizations. It examines the letters and graffiti not for what they tell us about the Roman poor as a category, but for what they reveal about specific people navigating specific challenges. Some complained bitterly about their circumstances, others expressed contentment or even joy. Both responses were valid, both were real. The debate extends to questions of consciousness and comparison. Did ordinary Romans feel oppressed by their circumstances, or did they accept them as natural and inevitable? Did they look at the wealthy with resentment or aspiration? Did they imagine alternatives to the social order they inhabited, or did hierarchy seem as fixed as the seasons? These questions are almost impossible to answer definitively, because the sources rarely address them directly. What we can say is that Romans themselves seem to recognize the gap between the city's grand self-image and daily reality. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st century, mocked the pretensions of the poor who tried to ape their betters, wearing togas they couldn't afford and attending literary readings they didn't understand. But he also attacked the corruption of the wealthy, their indifference to suffering, their hollow rituals. His Rome was a city of absurdities, where everyone was playing a role in a performance that had lost its meaning. The Christian writers of the later empire offered another perspective, condemning Roman society as fundamentally unjust, built on slavery and conquest, destined for divine judgment. For them, the apparent stability and order masked a spiritual emptiness, a civilization that had lost its soul in pursuit of power and pleasure. The daily life of Rome, in this view, was a kind of beautiful prison, comfortable enough to be tolerable, oppressive enough to be damning. Modern scholars continue to sift through the evidence, using new techniques and asking new questions. What did people eat? Not just the wealthy, but everyone. How did families organize themselves? What happened to the elderly, the disabled, the mentally ill? How much social mobility existed? How did people find meaning and joy in difficult circumstances? Each answer reveals more complexity, more variation, more humanity than the previous generation of historians imagined possible. The truth is that daily life in ancient Rome meant 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. It was both better and worse than we imagine, both more familiar and more alien. The theories help us think about it, but they can't capture it completely. For that, we need to walk through an actual day, to follow the rhythms from dawn to dusk and see what ordinary hours felt like in the shadow of eternity. The day begins before the sun, in the pre-dawn darkness of late summer. In the insulae, people wake to the sounds of the city stirring, the clatter of delivery carts that are only allowed on the streets at night, the voices of bakers already at work, the cry of a baby somewhere above or below. There are no alarm clocks, but the body knows when morning approaches, and besides, the walls are thin enough that once one person wakes, everyone wakes. Privacy is a luxury the poor cannot afford. The first task is always water. The public fountains run continuously, fed by the aqueducts that are perhaps Rome's greatest achievement, and families send someone, usually a slave or a child, to fill clay amphoras for the day's needs. The fountains are social spaces, places where neighbours meet and gossip and argue, where news spreads faster than any official announcement. This morning the talk is about grain prices, about a fire last week in the Subura district, about whether the games next month will be any good. Back in the apartment, breakfast is simple. Bread, always bread, the foundation of Roman existence. Perhaps dipped in wine mixed with water, perhaps a bit of olive oil if the family can afford it, cheese if there's money, olives. Rarely meat, except on festival days. The children eat quickly and scatter, some to work, some to play in the streets, some to schools if the family has pretensions and a few coins to spare for a teacher. The father, if there is one, if he's not dead or divorced or away in the army, leaves for work. The nature of that work varies infinitely. He might be a craftsman with a small shop on the ground floor of the insula, making shoes or pottery or metal fittings. He might be a labourer hired by the day to haul cargo from the docks or work on a construction site. He might be a freedman operating a small business, a tavern or a bakery, trying to scrape together enough profit to feed his family and maybe someday buy a better life. He might be a merchant negotiating deals in the forum, his toga carefully arranged to project respectability he may or may not possess. The mother stays home usually, though in poorer families she might work as well, taking in laundry or sewing, selling food from a street stall, doing whatever generates a few extra coins. Her day is filled with the endless labour of maintaining a household without modern conveniences. Drawing water, cooking over a small brazier or charcoal stove, constantly vigilant against fire. Washing clothes in cold water, scrubbing them against stone, mending, cleaning, managing children. The work never ends, and unlike her husband's labour, it generates no income and little recognition. By mid-morning, the streets are fully alive. Rome is loud, overwhelmingly loud by modern standards. Merchants shout their wares, Construction workers hammer and saw. Animals bray and bark and cluck. Carts rattle over cobblestones. People argue, laugh, bargain, gossip. The noise echoes off the buildings and becomes a kind of roar, the voice of the city itself, relentless and inescapable. The forum fills with people conducting business, both legal and commercial. Lawyers take cases under the colonnades. Money changers set up their tables. Merchants display goods from across the empire, silk from the east, pottery from Gaul, glassware from Alexandria. Everything can be bought and sold here, including people. This slave market does brisk business on certain days. The senators arrive later, moving through the crowds with an air of entitlement, their togas marking them as men of consequence, their retinues of clients and slaves clearing the way. Noon approaches, and the heat builds. This is the dead time, when sensible people retreat indoors or seek shade. The shops close for a few hours. Those who can afford it nap. The streets quiet slightly, though they never truly empty. The sun beats down on marble and stone, turning the city into an oven, and people wait for the relief of afternoon. Around the 8th hour, life resumes. This is when many Romans head to the baths, the great public complexes that serve as gyms, social clubs, and community centres. They pay their small fee and enter a world of routine luxury. First the exercise yard, wrestling or playing ball or simply walking. Then the progression through heated rooms of increasing temperature, sweating out the day's grime and stress. Then the cold plunge, shocking and invigorating. Then perhaps time in the library or the gardens, conversations with friends, deals made in whispers, gossip traded like currency. The baths are democratic in a way that almost nothing else in Rome is. Certainly there are better baths for the wealthy, private clubs with exclusive access. But the public baths mix everyone together, senator and shopkeeper, freedman and slave, all of them naked and temporarily equal in the steam. It's here that you hear the real news, the rumours that never make it to official channels, the truth beneath the propaganda. Evening comes and families gather for the main meal. For the poor it's usually more bread, perhaps with a stew of beans and vegetables, flavoured with a bit of salt pork if they're lucky. They eat sitting on benches or cushions in their cramped apartment, the lamp burning precious oil, the conversation about the day's events and tomorrow's concerns. For the wealthy, it's an elaborate affair, multiple courses, imported delicacies, entertainment, conversation about literature and politics, a performance of culture and refinement that separates them from the masses. As darkness falls, the city transforms. The streets become dangerous, unlighted except by the moon and occasional torches. Criminals emerge, fires break out. The night watch patrols, though their effectiveness is limited. Most people stay inside, doors barred, windows shuttered, waiting for dawn to make the world safe again, and then eventually sleep, on thin mattresses stuffed with straw, with the sounds of the city muted but never silent, with tomorrow waiting, another day in the eternal city, ordinary and precious, and already running out. The objects survive where the stories don't. Museums are filled with them, though they rarely get the prominence of imperial statues or golden treasures. They sit in storage drawers and back galleries, the detritus of daily life, too common to be valuable, too fragmentary to be impressive. But for historians trying to understand how ordinary Romans actually lived, these humble artifacts are worth more than all the emperor's gold. Start with the pottery. Romans used ceramic vessels for everything, cooking pots and storage jars, drinking cups and serving bowls, oil lamps and roof tiles. Pottery breaks easily but lasts forever, and the shards accumulate in layers that archaeologists sift through like pages in a book. Each piece tells something about trade networks, about eating habits, about aesthetic preferences. A pot made in Gaul and found in Rome speaks to commercial connections. A lamp decorated with erotic scenes speaks to attitudes about sexuality. A cooking pot with burn marks on the bottom speaks to countless meals prepared and consumed and forgotten. The oil lamps are particularly informative. Every Roman household needed them, dozens of them, because night came early and work didn't stop just because the sun went down. They burned olive oil, expensive but necessary, and they came in an astonishing variety of styles. Plain clay for the poor, bronze for the wealthy, some decorated with gods or heroes, others with gladiators or chariots or theatrical masks, still others with crude jokes or sexual imagery. The lamps lit Roman nights for centuries, and now they sit behind glass, their wicks long cold, bearing witness to all those vanished evenings. The shoes are haunting. Dozens of Roman shoes have been found, preserved in wells or bogs or trash heaps, leather and wood and cork still holding the shape of feet that walked the streets 2,000 years ago. Children's shoes, tiny and worn, women's shoes with delicate straps, men's heavy work boots with hobnailed soles. Each one was made for a specific person, wore down in a specific pattern, walked specific streets now buried under 20 feet of modern city. To hold one is to touch someone's actual life, the leather they wore, the steps they took. The coins are everywhere, scattered through the archaeological record like confetti. Bronze and silver and occasionally gold, stamped with the faces of emperors and the symbols of power. But more interesting are the denominations, the small bronze coins that ordinary people used for daily transactions. A coin worth 1 loaf of bread, a coin worth admission to the public baths, a coin worth a cup of wine. Each one represents a small choice, a small transaction, a moment of exchange in the great economy of survival. The writing tablets preserve the most intimate details. Wax-coated wooden boards that could be written on with a stylus, and then erased and reused. They were the notebooks and scratch pads of the Roman world. Most of the wax is gone now, but sometimes the stylus pressed hard enough to mark the wood beneath, and those marks can be read under special light. Shopping lists, arithmetic lessons, draft letters, personal notes. One tablet found in London contains a birthday party invitation from one woman to another. Another records a soldier's complaint about his boots falling apart. The graffiti already discussed continues to yield new insights as technology improves. Multispectral imaging can now read text that's been weathered away or painted over. Laser scanning creates three-dimensional models of inscribed surfaces, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. Each new technique recovers more voices, more opinions, more evidence of the lives that official history ignored. The food remains tell stories of diet and health. Animal bones in trash heaps reveal what people ate and in what proportions. Pollen from ancient drains shows what plants grew in the Roman gardens. Seeds preserved in waterlogged soil identify crops and weeds. Chemical analysis of drinking water reveals lead contamination from pipes, explaining perhaps some of the health problems that plagued the population. Parasites in ancient sewage indicate endemic diseases and poor sanitation, despite the famous Roman toilets and baths. The children's toys are perhaps the most poignant artifacts. Dolls made of clay or wood or cloth, most of them now fragmentary. Miniature animals carved from bone, marbles, dice. Game boards scratched into paving stones. These objects speak to the universality of childhood, to the play that transcends culture and era. Roman children played house and played soldiers, raced each other and told stories, just like children everywhere, in every time. The toys survived, the children didn't. But the toys remember. The medical instruments are brutal and sophisticated simultaneously. Bronze scalpels and bone saws. Gynecological speculums remarkably similar to modern designs. Forceps and probes. Catheters and feeding tubes. The Romans understood surgery, could perform cataract removal, could set broken bones. They had painkillers, opium and mandrake and wine. They had some understanding of infection and the importance of cleanliness. They also had a mortality rate that would horrify modern medicine, but they tried, and their tools prove it. The jewellery ranges from exquisite to crude. Gold rings set with gemstones for the wealthy. Bronze fibulae, the ancient equivalent of safety pins, decorated with enamel for the middling sort. Bone hairpins for the poor. Glass beads, cheap and colourful, within reach of almost anyone. The desire for adornment, for beauty, for status symbols, crossed all class boundaries. Everyone wanted something pretty to wear, something that said, "I matter, I have worth." The locks and keys proved that Romans worried about theft and privacy just like we do. Complex mechanical locks, surprisingly sophisticated, protected doors and chests. The keys are works of art in themselves, bronze and iron, often worn as rings so they couldn't be lost or stolen. The existence of so many locks suggests a society where trust was limited and possessions had to be guarded. These objects, thousands upon thousands of them, form a material record of daily existence that complements and often contradicts the written sources. They can't tell us everything. They can't explain emotions or motivations. But they ground the history in physical reality, in the actual stuff of life, in the things that people made and used and threw away and never imagined we'd care about. The artifacts are honest in a way that nothing else is. They're just what they are, unguarded evidence of ordinary days. Beneath the routine of daily life, something was shifting that no one quite understood. The signs were there, scattered through the fabric of ordinary existence, small anomalies that didn't yet form a pattern but would, in retrospect, reveal a civilization in the early stages of unravelling. The problem was that no one living through it could see the whole picture. They only saw their own piece, their own small disruption, and assumed it was temporary, local, a problem that would be solved soon enough. They didn't know they were watching the beginning of the end. The grain shipments had become less reliable. Not dramatically so, not enough to cause panic, but enough that people noticed. A delay here, a shortage there, prices fluctuating more than usual. The officials blamed weather, blamed pirates, blamed inefficiency at the ports. The people grumbled but accepted the explanations. After all, the grain had always come eventually. The system had always worked. Why would this time be different? But the truth was more complicated. The provinces that fed Rome, Egypt and North Africa primarily, were having their own problems. Barbarian raids disrupting agriculture. Local populations growing restless under imperial taxation. The infrastructure of collection and transport becoming harder to maintain as resources flowed to more urgent military needs. Rome's food supply depended on a complex system that required peace, prosperity and stable governance across thousands of miles. Those conditions were eroding, slowly but surely, and the effects were starting to reach the capital. The quality of public works had declined noticeably. The aqueduct still ran, but maintenance had been deferred. Small leaks became larger leaks. Pressure dropped. Some neighbourhoods that had once received reliable water now had intermittent service. The public fountains still flowed mostly, but people complained about having to walk farther, wait longer, argue more fiercely for their share. The city engineers blamed budget constraints, staffing shortages, the difficulty of obtaining materials. No one connected it to the larger pattern of decline. Similarly, the roads were deteriorating. The great highways that connected Rome to its empire had once been maintained with obsessive care, repaved regularly, drainage kept clear, bridges repaired immediately. But now potholes went unfilled. Bridges developed cracks that went unpatched. The traffic still flowed, but more slowly, more dangerously. Merchants complained about damaged wheels, about delays, about the rising cost of transport. The officials promised repairs that came slowly or not at all. Crime was rising, though again not dramatically enough to cause panic. Burglaries were more common, muggings after dark, pickpockets in the Forum. The city watch seemed less effective, or perhaps there were simply fewer of them. Certainly they seemed less motivated, less interested in pursuing criminals or protecting citizens. People adapted by staying indoors more at night, by hiding their valuables more carefully, by accepting a level of danger that their parents' generation would have found shocking. The currency was another troubling sign. Silver coins that should have been pure silver were increasingly mixed with base metals, making them lighter, less valuable. Bronze coins were smaller than they used to be. Prices crept upward, not in a sudden inflationary burst but in a steady erosion of purchasing power that was hard to pin down but impossible to ignore. A loaf of bread that cost 1 coin now cost 2. A cup of wine was twice what it had been 5 years ago. Wages weren't keeping pace. People noticed these things individually, but rarely connected them into a systemic pattern. The human mind resists seeing decline in real time. We adjust, we adapt, we assume things will get better. Our parents' generation becomes the golden age, back when everything worked properly, when officials were honest, when Rome was truly Rome. We don't recognise that we're becoming someone else's fallen golden age. The religious landscape was changing too in ways that were hard to articulate but deeply felt. The old temples seemed emptier. The traditional festivals less enthusiastic. Christianity was growing, offering a different kind of certainty, a different explanation for why things felt wrong. The world is fallen, the Christians said. The old gods are false. Rome's glory was always an illusion. Only Christ offers real hope. Many people, especially the poor, found this message compelling. It explained their suffering, promised eventual justice, gave meaning to hardship. But this shift created its own tensions. Christian emperors now ruled, but half the population still honoured the old gods. Families were divided, communities fragmented. The shared civic religion that had once united Romans across class lines was fracturing into competing faiths, competing loyalties, competing visions of what Rome was and should be. The social glue was dissolving. The army was changing too. Fewer Romans served in the legions now. More and more, the empire relied on barbarian federates, foreign tribes who fought under their own leaders in exchange for land and payment. In theory, they defended Roman interests. In practice, their loyalties were negotiable, and they were learning Roman tactics, Roman organisation, Roman weaknesses. The empire was training its own eventual conquerors, though no one quite admitted this yet. Immigration patterns were shifting. Barbarian settlers were everywhere now, not just beyond the frontier but within the empire itself, sometimes peacefully integrated, sometimes a source of tension and resentment. They brought different customs, different languages, different assumptions about how society should work. Rome had always absorbed foreigners, had always turned them into Romans. But now the process seemed to be running in reverse, Romans becoming barbarized, adopting foreign dress and customs and values. All of these cracks, these small failures and shifts and erosions, were happening simultaneously, each one explicable on its own, none of them obviously catastrophic. A Roman living through it might feel vaguely anxious, might sense that things weren't quite right, but would struggle to articulate exactly what had changed or why it mattered. The routine continued. People got up, went to work, fed their families, entertained themselves, went to bed. Life went on. But the foundation was cracking, invisibly, unstoppably, and soon the weight of empire would be too much for the weakened structure to bear. The ships didn't arrive on schedule in late summer of 409. At first, it seemed like a normal delay. Mediterranean weather could be unpredictable. Storms delayed cargo. Pirates required naval escorts that slowed convoys. Bureaucratic tangles at the Egyptian ports were legendary. The grain would come, it always came. Rome had been fed by Africa and Egypt for centuries. The system was too big, too important, too fundamental to fail. But days passed, then weeks, and the warehouses began to empty. The grain dole, that sacred promise that kept the Roman mob fed and quiet, was reduced, then reduced again. Prices in the private markets spiked. Bread, the foundation of Roman existence, became expensive, then very expensive, then, for many, unaffordable. The city that had taken its food supply for granted suddenly faced the prospect of genuine hunger. Panic started in the poorer neighbourhoods and spread upward through the social hierarchy like fire climbing a building. Fights broke out at the public distributions. People hoarded what they could get, hiding sacks of grain in their apartments, guarding them like treasure. Merchants raised prices daily, sometimes hourly, extracting every coin they could from desperate customers. The government issued proclamations against profiteering, threatened punishment for hoarding, promised that more grain was coming soon. No one believed them. The truth, when it emerged in fragments and rumours, was worse than simple logistics. The grain wasn't delayed, it wasn't coming at all. Alaric and his Visigoths camped in southern Italy had cut the supply lines. The roads from the ports were blocked. The ships that did make it to Ostia couldn't unload safely. The elaborate system that had fed Rome for so long had been severed with brutal efficiency. The barbarians hadn't attacked the city directly. They'd done something smarter. They'd starved it. The wealthy at first were insulated. They had private stocks, grain stored from their estates, connections to suppliers who would sell to them regardless of shortages. But even they began to worry as the situation dragged on. Their clients, the masses of dependent poor who looked to them for protection and patronage, became desperate and then angry. The social contract that bound Roman society together, protection and food, in exchange for political support and deference, was breaking down. The poor could not eat promises. The rich could not hide forever behind their gates. Rome had faced food crises before. In the Republic, during civil wars, during periods of administrative collapse, the grain supply had faltered and then recovered. But this felt different. The mechanisms that should have solved the problem, imperial authority, naval power, diplomatic negotiation, all seemed paralysed. The Emperor Honorius was in Ravenna, safe behind his marshes, apparently more concerned with his poultry collection than with the starving capital. The Senate debated and argued and passed resolutions that had no effect. The military was elsewhere, fighting other battles, defending other frontiers, too scattered and too weak to break the siege. Ordinary Romans, going about their daily routines, suddenly found those routines impossible to maintain. The baker couldn't bake without grain. His customers couldn't buy what wasn't there. The whole intricate web of urban life, predicated on abundant food and stable prices, began to disintegrate. People who had jobs found them suddenly meaningless. What good was work if there was no food to buy? What good was money if the shelves were empty? Some fled the city, taking whatever they could carry and heading into the countryside, hoping to find food in the villages and farms. But the countryside was dangerous, roamed by barbarians and bandits, its own population barely scraping by. Many who left Rome disappeared into that uncertain landscape and were never heard from again. Those who stayed faced increasingly desperate choices. Families sold possessions to buy food at inflated prices. When possessions ran out, they sold themselves or their children into slavery in exchange for guaranteed meals. The slave markets, usually a place where the poor were bought and sold by the rich, inverted bizarrely as free people voluntarily surrendered their freedom for survival. It was a kind of slow-motion catastrophe, not dramatic but devastating, grinding away at the foundations of society one hungry day at a time. The psychological impact was perhaps as significant as the physical. Romans had believed, deeply and without question, that their city was special, protected by gods and history and the sheer weight of its own greatness. The grain would always come because Rome was Rome, the centre of the world, the eternal city. To watch that certainty crumble, to realise that Rome could be starved like any other city, that eternity was a lie, was traumatic in ways that went beyond mere hunger. The authorities tried everything they could think of. They negotiated with Alaric, offering gold and hostages and political recognition. He took what they offered and then demanded more. They tried to organise relief convoys by alternate routes. The convoys were ambushed or simply couldn't get through. They tried to rally the population with speeches about Roman virtue and endurance. The hungry crowds listened sullenly and then went back to searching for food. August turned to September. The heat of summer gave way to cooler autumn days. The hunger didn't ease. If anything, it worsened as stockpiles dwindled and desperation grew. People began to die, not dramatically, not in numbers that overwhelmed the city, but steadily. The very old, the very young, the already sick. They slipped away quietly, and their bodies were burned or buried, and life went on for those who remained. This was the turning point, the moment when the unthinkable became real, when Rome's vulnerability was exposed for all to see. The city had survived barbarian invasions before. It had survived civil wars and plagues and fires. But it had never before been systematically starved, never before had to watch its food supply strangled while its emperor did nothing and its armies stood elsewhere. The bread had stopped coming, and Rome, for the first time in its long history, had no answer. September became October, and Rome transformed into something its citizens barely recognized. The streets, usually choked with traffic and noise, grew quieter. Fewer merchants opened their shops. Fewer carts rattled over the cobblestones. The Forum, that great beating heart of Roman civic life, saw sparse attendance as people conserved energy and avoided the public spaces where hunger was too visible, too collective, too frightening. The city that had defined itself through constant motion and commerce now moved in slow, careful rhythms, everyone trying to make what little they had last as long as possible. The social fabric that had held Rome together began to fray in unexpected ways. Neighbours who had lived beside each other for years turned suspicious, watching to see who had food, who might be hiding supplies. Accusations of hoarding became common, sometimes justified, often not. The traditional bonds of patronage, where wealthy Romans supported networks of poorer clients in exchange for political loyalty, strained under the weight of too many mouths and too little grain. Some patrons continued to share what they had, earning genuine loyalty and gratitude. Others closed their doors, and their clients remembered. Crime evolved from opportunistic to desperate. People broke into warehouses looking for food that wasn't there. They robbed travellers on the roads leading into the city. They stole from each other, from temples, from anywhere that might yield something edible or tradable. The city watch, undermanned and underpaid, could barely respond. Many of the watchmen were hungry themselves, making them either ineffective or corrupt, willing to look the other way for a share of whatever was being stolen. The bathhouses, those democratic spaces where all classes mixed, began to empty. The poor couldn't afford even the small entrance fee, not when that money might buy a handful of grain. The wealthy still went, but less frequently, and the experience was different now, shadowed by guilt and fear. It was hard to relax in warm water when you knew people were starving 3 blocks away. Hard to enjoy leisure when the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Religious observance intensified in ways both traditional and desperate. The old temples saw increased attendance as people made offerings to Jupiter and Mars and the household gods, begging for intervention, for rain or rescue, or simply for endurance. The Christians gathered in their churches and prayed to their God, and their message of suffering as redemption, of earthly hunger as temporary compared to eternal salvation, resonated with new force. Some converted out of genuine faith. Others converted because the Christian communities were better organized for mutual aid, pooling resources and feeding their own when the state could not. The aristocracy retreated into their villas and tried to maintain normalcy behind high walls and locked gates. They still had food, drawn from their country estates, smuggled in by loyal servants, purchased at astronomical prices from black market dealers. They dined on reduced portions, but dined nonetheless. They hosted smaller gatherings, quieter entertainments. They discussed the crisis in philosophical terms, debating whether this was divine punishment or simply bad luck, whether Rome's difficulties were temporary or terminal. They did not, for the most part, open their storerooms to the masses. Self-preservation won out over civic duty. The Senate met irregularly and accomplished little. There was endless debate about how to break the siege, how to secure food, how to negotiate with Alaric. Proposals were made and rejected. Factions formed and dissolved. Some senators argued for paying whatever Alaric demanded. Others insisted on maintaining Roman dignity, refusing to submit to barbarian extortion. A few suggested raising an army from the citizens themselves, but Rome had long since stopped training its population for war. The debating chamber, once a place of real power, had become a stage for performance, words without consequence, speeches that changed nothing. Meanwhile, beyond the walls, Alaric waited. His army was well supplied, drawing food from the Italian countryside they controlled. They had no reason to assault the walls. Time was their weapon, and it was working perfectly. Every day Rome stayed under siege was another day of weakening, another day when the great city grew hungrier and more desperate. Eventually, they would have to surrender. Eventually, they would have to open the gates. Alaric could afford to be patient. Inside the city, people adapted in ways both noble and degrading. Families shared what they had with relatives and close friends, creating small networks of survival. Strangers sometimes helped each other, humanity persisting even in crisis. But there was also the darker adaptation. Prostitution increased as people sold their bodies for food. Parents abandoned children they could no longer feed. The old and sick were left to die alone because caring for them meant less for the healthy and young. The education of children, that marker of civilization, largely ceased. Schools closed. Teachers couldn't work without payment, and parents couldn't pay. The children who had been learning their letters and rhetoric now spent their days scavenging, looking for anything edible, learning instead the skills of survival in a city coming apart. A generation's education was interrupted, another invisible casualty of the siege. Documents from this period, the few that survive, carry a tone of surreal detachment. Official correspondence continues to use formal language and proper titles, as if maintaining bureaucratic protocol could somehow preserve the reality it described. A letter from a minor official requests clarification on tax policy, as if the tax system still functioned. A court record notes a property dispute as if property values still mattered. The machinery of empire kept grinding away on paper, even as it seized up in reality. The psychological toll was harder to document but no less real. Depression spread through the population like disease. What was the point of going on when tomorrow looked worse than today? When the empire that promised eternal security couldn't keep its own capital fed? When the gods, whether old or new, seemed indifferent to suffering? Some people simply gave up, stopped eating what little they had, died not from lack of food but from lack of will. Others doubled down on hope, convincing themselves that rescue was imminent, that the emperor would send an army, that the grain ships would break through, that God or the gods would intervene. Hope became a kind of currency, traded in whispers and rumours. Someone had heard that reinforcements were coming from Gaul. Someone else knew for certain that Alaric was about to withdraw. The rumours were never true, but they served a purpose, giving people a reason to endure one more day. October deepened. The city held its breath and waited. The siege of Rome in 409 didn't just change the city, it changed the course of Western civilization. When we think about the fall of Rome, we often imagine dramatic battles and barbarian hordes pouring through breached walls. But the real transformation was quieter, more insidious, and it began here, in these months of hunger and paralysis, when the eternal city discovered it was mortal after all. The psychological impact of this realization rippled outward through space and time in ways the starving citizens could never have imagined. First, and most immediately, it shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. For 1,000 years, Rome had been the centre, the unquestioned master of the Mediterranean world. Cities might rise and fall, kingdoms might appear and vanish, but Rome endured. That certainty, that deep cultural confidence, evaporated in the autumn of 409. If Rome could be starved into submission, then nothing was permanent, nothing was guaranteed. The psychological foundation of Western civilization cracked, and the crack would only widen. The political consequences were equally profound. The siege exposed the fatal weakness of the late Roman system, an emperor who ruled in name only, distant from the capital and unable or unwilling to defend it. Honorius in Ravenna, safe behind his marshes, caring more for his birds than his people, became a symbol of imperial irrelevance. The Senate, once the voice of Roman power, revealed itself as toothless, capable only of debate while real power rested with barbarian warlords. The forms of government persisted, but the substance was gone. Later generations would remember this and build different systems where power couldn't hide from responsibility quite so easily. Economically, the siege demonstrated the fragility of urban civilization when supply lines break. Rome had been perhaps the first city in history to sustain a population of nearly 1 million people, an achievement made possible only through an elaborate network of trade, taxation, and transport spanning an empire. When that network failed, when the grain ships stopped coming, the city couldn't feed itself. The surrounding countryside had been turned over to villas and orchards, luxury production for the wealthy, not basic agriculture for the masses. Rome had traded local resilience for imperial reach, and when the reach contracted, the city starved. This lesson was not lost on the medieval world that followed. Towns and cities in the Middle Ages remained smaller, more connected to their agricultural hinterlands, less dependent on long-distance trade for basic necessities. The Roman model of the great megalopolis, brilliant but vulnerable, would not be attempted again in the West for over 1,000 years. When cities finally did grow large again in the Industrial Age, they did so with different technologies and different trade patterns, but the memory of Rome's vulnerability lingered. Culturally, the siege accelerated the decline of classical paganism and the rise of Christianity. When the old gods failed to protect Rome, when Jupiter and Mars and all the traditional deities of the city proved powerless to stop starvation, their credibility collapsed. The Christians, meanwhile, had an explanation ready-made. Rome suffered because it was built on false gods and earthly pride. Only through Christ could true salvation come, and salvation wasn't about preserving cities or empires, it was about individual souls and eternal life. This message, tested in the crucible of Rome's suffering, emerged stronger and more appealing. Within a generation, paganism would be not just out of favour but actively suppressed. The shift to Christianity wasn't merely religious, it was structural. The Church, with its networks of bishops and monasteries, its systems of mutual aid and poor relief, was better organised than the collapsing imperial bureaucracy. When the state couldn't feed people, Christian communities did, at least for their own members. This practical competence, as much as theological appeal, drove conversions and established the Church as the real government in many areas. The medieval fusion of church and state, so different from the Roman separation, began here, in the crisis when religious institutions proved more reliable than secular ones. Militarily, the siege taught barbarian leaders that they didn't need to defeat Rome in open battle. They could simply isolate it, cut its supplies, and wait. This strategy would be used again and again in the coming years. More importantly, the siege demonstrated that Rome's vaunted legions couldn't be everywhere at once, that the empire had overextended itself and could no longer protect its core territories. The barbarian kingdoms that would emerge from Rome's collapse learned this lesson well, preferring negotiation and calculated pressure over costly direct confrontation. The longer-term impact on European political development was equally significant. The idea of a single universal empire, which Rome had embodied for so long, began to fragment into regional kingdoms with their own identities and interests. The barbarian federates who had been Rome's allies began to see themselves as independent powers. The provinces started thinking locally rather than imperially. The unified Mediterranean world that Rome had created started to break into the patchwork of competing kingdoms that would define the Middle Ages. Intellectually, the siege contributed to a shift in how people thought about history and progress. The classical view had been essentially optimistic. Civilizations grew more sophisticated, knowledge accumulated, the future would be better than the past. But Rome's decline suggested something different, that civilizations could move backward, that knowledge could be lost, that the future might be darker than the past. This more pessimistic historical consciousness would shape medieval thought and persist in Western culture as a counterweight to progressive optimism. Even our physical world bears traces of that autumn siege. The ruins of Rome, never fully rebuilt to their ancient glory, became quarries for medieval churches and Renaissance palaces. The marble of the Forum was broken up and burned for lime. The great monuments, too massive to destroy completely, were repurposed or simply absorbed into new contexts. The layered archaeology of Rome, which makes it such a fascinating city today, owes much to the fact that after 409 there was never enough wealth or will to restore what was lost. The siege was a hinge moment, when one world ended and another began. The Romans living through it couldn't see the full scope of what was happening. They were just trying to survive. But their suffering, their choices, their failures, shaped a millennium of European history. History is made of individuals, and 3 lives intersected in Rome that autumn, each experiencing the crisis in their own way. Marcus Aurelius Septimus, the baker, had risen before dawn every day of his adult life. His shop occupied the ground floor of an insula in the Subura district, his ovens built into the wall, their heat warming the apartments above. For 20 years he had baked bread, the same process his father taught him, the same process his father's father knew. The work was hot, exhausting, and profitable. Romans needed bread the way they needed air, and a baker who kept his ovens hot and his prices reasonable could make a decent living. But now his ovens were cold. The grain he needed, the foundation of his entire existence, had stopped coming. He still had some flour, hoarded carefully, enough for perhaps 2 more weeks if he rationed it. But then what? His wife watched him with worried eyes. His children, 3 of them still living, asked when they could have proper bread again instead of the thin porridge she was stretching to feed them. He had no answer. Marcus had always thought of himself as a practical man, not given to philosophy or grand thoughts about empire. His world was flour and yeast and fire, the simple transformation of grain into sustenance. But now, with his ovens cold and his family hungry, he found himself thinking about things he'd never questioned before. Why had Rome been so dependent on grain from Egypt? Why hadn't anyone prepared for this? Why was the emperor in Ravenna while Rome starved? The questions had no good answers, only the growing realization that the world he'd counted on was built on assumptions that were proving false. He'd tried to keep the shop open for a while, selling from his reserves at normal prices despite what the black marketers were charging. It seemed like the right thing to do, the Roman thing to do. But his neighbours, desperate and afraid, had bought everything in a single day, and now they looked at him with suspicion, certain he must be hiding more. He'd locked the shop and stopped answering the door. Trust, he realised, was another casualty of hunger. Across the city on the Palatine Hill, Senator Gaius Flavius Marcellus was having different problems. His family had been prominent since the Republic, their lineage traced back 5 centuries, their name appearing in histories and inscriptions throughout Rome. He owned estates in Africa and Sicily, villas in the countryside, properties in the city. He was wealthy in a way Marcus the baker could barely imagine, and yet he too felt the siege closing in. His steward had brought troubling news that morning. The estate in Africa was no longer sending revenues. The land was still there, presumably, but the administration had collapsed. Bandits controlled the roads. The local population was keeping what they harvested rather than paying it to a distant landlord in a starving city. The Sicilian estates were barely better. For the first time in his life, Gaius understood that wealth wasn't gold and land. It was the system that made gold and land meaningful. When the system stopped working, when loyalty and law and commerce broke down, even senators could find themselves vulnerable. He'd attended the Senate session yesterday, a sparsely attended affair where nothing of substance was accomplished. The debate had been about whether to send another embassy to Alaric, offering more gold, more concessions, more humiliation. Gaius had argued against it, invoking the dignity of Rome, the traditions of their ancestors who never submitted to barbarians. But even as he spoke, he wondered if dignity could fill stomachs. His fellow senators had listened politely and then voted to send the embassy anyway. Dignity apparently was negotiable. At home, his wife asked when they should leave for their country villa. It was a reasonable question. Many aristocratic families had already fled, abandoning the city to its fate. But leaving felt like a kind of treason, an admission that Rome was finished. Gaius kept delaying the decision, hoping something would change, knowing that every day he waited made the journey more dangerous. His ancestors had served Rome for 500 years. Could he be the one who ran? In the household of Senator Marcellus, in a small room off the kitchen, lived a woman named Helena. She was a slave, though she'd been born free in a village in Gaul 40 years ago. Raiders had taken her when she was young, sold her in Rome, and she'd spent her entire adult life in service to the Marcellus family. She'd raised the senator's children alongside her own daughter, born to another slave and never acknowledged by the father. She'd cleaned and cooked and managed the household, invisible to the guests who came for dinner parties, but essential to the family's daily functioning. The siege had changed her life in ways both subtle and profound. The household had shrunk. Many of the slaves sent to the country estates or sold off as luxuries became unaffordable. The work was harder now, fewer hands doing the same tasks. But there was also a strange freedom in the chaos. The normal hierarchies were loosening. The mistress of the house treated her with something approaching respect, needing her competence more than ever. The senator himself had spoken to her directly last week, asking her advice about food storage, actually listening to her answer. Helena had no illusions about her status. She was still property, still subject to the whims of her owners. But she'd also noticed that property rights seemed less absolute lately. Some slaves were simply walking away from their masters, and in the chaos of the siege, no one was pursuing them. She'd thought about it herself, thought about taking her daughter and disappearing into the confusion. But where would they go? How would they survive? At least here, in this household, there was still food, still some measure of safety. Her daughter Julia was 14 and beautiful, and Helena watched her with a mother's fear. In normal times, a slave girl's beauty was a kind of currency, possibly leading to a good position, maybe even manumission if she caught the right eye. But these weren't normal times, and beauty could be dangerous. Helena had started keeping Julia closer, teaching her to move through the house invisibly to avoid attention. Survival, she was learning, required different skills than advancement. These three people, the baker, the senator, the slave, never met. Their lives moved in separate circles, touching only at the margins where commerce and class intersected. But they were all Romans, all living through the same crisis, all trying to make sense of a world coming apart. Their choices, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of the city itself. Marcus wondered if he should sell his shop and buy passage out of Rome. Gaius debated whether to flee to safety or stay and face whatever came. Helena calculated how long she could wait before making a desperate choice. None of them knew the right answer. None of them could see the future. They could only live through each day and hope they'd survive to see the next. Not everyone was surprised by Rome's crisis. Some had been warning about it for years. In a small house near the Forum of Trajan lived an elderly scholar named Rufinus, a man most of his neighbours considered eccentric at best and possibly mad. For the past 2 decades, he'd been compiling what he called a chronicle of decline, documenting every sign of imperial weakness he could find. Reduced tax revenues, abandoned villas, barbarian settlements within the empire, military defeats disguised as diplomatic victories, the substitution of ceremony for substance in government. He'd filled scroll after scroll with observations, creating an archive of decay that no one wanted to read. Rufinus had tried, in his younger years, to warn people. He'd written letters to officials. He'd given speeches back when anyone would listen. He'd argued in the Senate before he'd been politely but firmly encouraged to retire from public life. His message was always the same. Rome was living beyond its means. The military was overextended. The provinces were being bled dry by taxation. The barbarians weren't being defeated, they were being temporarily bought off. The entire structure was unsustainable, and catastrophe was inevitable. People had called him a pessimist, a traitor, a man who'd lost faith in Rome's eternal destiny. Didn't he know that Rome had faced crises before and always emerged stronger? Didn't he understand that doomsaying was self-fulfilling, that confidence and will were as important as material resources? Didn't he see that his negative attitude undermined the very foundations he claimed to defend? But Rufinus had seen something his critics missed. He'd travelled widely in his youth, visited the provinces, talked to farmers and merchants and local officials. He'd noticed the pattern, how prosperity flowed to Rome while the provinces struggled, how the burden of empire fell most heavily on those least able to bear it, how resentment grew in the hearts of people who were nominally Roman, but felt like subjects of a foreign power. He'd understood that empire wasn't just about military force, it was about willing cooperation, and that cooperation was eroding. Now, in the autumn of 409, with Rome under siege and starving, Rufinus allowed himself a bit of vindication. He'd been right. They'd been wrong. The catastrophe he'd predicted was unfolding exactly as he'd foreseen. But the satisfaction was hollow. Being right didn't fill stomachs or open gates. Being right didn't save the city he'd tried to warn. It only meant he'd get to watch the end with his eyes open. In the Christian community of Rome, a different kind of opposition had emerged, one that didn't seek to save the empire but to transcend it. Bishop Innocentius led the community with a message that was simultaneously comforting and radical. Rome's suffering, he preached, was not a tragedy, but a revelation. The earthly city, built on pride and conquest, was showing its true nature. Only the city of God, the spiritual kingdom of Christ, offered real security. This message attracted people whom the traditional Roman ideology had failed. The poor, who'd received little benefit from imperial glory, found hope in the promise of spiritual equality. The disillusioned, who'd watched the empire's claims ring increasingly hollow, appreciated the honesty of a faith that said earthly kingdoms were temporary. The suffering, searching for meaning in their pain, embraced a theology that made suffering itself redemptive. But Innocentius's message was also political, though he'd have denied it. By shifting focus from the earthly city to the heavenly one, by arguing that Christians owed their ultimate loyalty to God rather than emperor, he was undermining the foundations of Roman civic religion. The old compact, where gods protected Rome in exchange for worship, and Rome protected its people in exchange for loyalty, was being replaced by something new, a universal church that transcended national boundaries, a faith that welcomed barbarian and Roman alike, a vision of community not based on citizenship or conquest but on shared belief. The traditional pagan opposition, still significant though declining, saw this Christian message as defeatist and dangerous. In the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the ancient heart of Roman religion, priests continued their rituals and prayed for deliverance. They argued, to anyone who would listen, that Rome's troubles came precisely from abandoning the gods who'd made Rome great. Jupiter, Mars, Quirinus, these were the deities who'd blessed Rome's rise. Turning away from them had brought catastrophe. Return to the old ways, restore the old worship, and Rome would be saved. But their voices carried less weight now. The emperors were Christian. The state funding for pagan temples had dried up. The great festivals were shadows of their former glory. Young people, even from traditional families, were converting. The old religion was dying not from persecution but from irrelevance, from its inability to explain or address the present crisis in terms that made sense to people who were suffering. There were also those who opposed not just Rome's current policies, but the entire imperial project. In taverns and on street corners, when people thought they were safe from informers, radical voices suggested that maybe Rome deserved to fall. Maybe empire itself was the problem. Maybe the endless conquests and the extraction of wealth from subject peoples had created a moral debt that was now coming due. Maybe the barbarians, far from being destroyers, were liberators freeing the provinces from Roman tyranny. These were dangerous thoughts, seditious thoughts, and most people wouldn't voice them even anonymously. But they circulated nonetheless, in whispers and hints and coded language. The idea that Rome's fall might not be a catastrophe but a reckoning, not an ending but a transformation, gained traction among those who'd never fully bought into the imperial ideology. A former soldier named Aulus, invalided out of the legions after losing an arm in Gaul, spoke openly about what he'd seen during his service. The atrocities committed in Rome's name, the villages burned, the populations enslaved, the rebellions crushed with calculated brutality. He'd fought for Rome, believed in Rome, bled for Rome. But he'd also seen what Rome cost, and he'd come to believe the price was too high. We called it peace, he said to anyone who would listen, his empty sleeve a testament to his credibility. But it was the peace of the graveyard, the peace of people too broken to resist. Now someone's finally breaking us, and maybe that's justice. Not many agreed with him, or at least not many admitted it. But his words planted seeds, questions about whether the world Rome had built was worth defending, whether its fall was a tragedy or a necessity, whether the future might somehow be better than the past. All of these voices, the scholar documenting decline, the bishop preaching transcendence, the pagans calling for return, the radicals questioning everything, they formed a kind of opposition chorus, alternatives to the official narrative that Rome was eternal and its crisis temporary. They wouldn't save the city. But they offered frameworks for understanding what was happening, ways of making meaning from catastrophe. And in a city running out of everything else, meaning was a kind of sustenance. Paradoxically, as Rome weakened politically, it experienced a flowering of intellectual and artistic urgency, unlike anything in recent memory. The crisis stripped away pretense and forced people to confront fundamental questions they'd been avoiding for generations. What did it mean to be Roman? What was worth preserving from the past? What needed to change for anything to survive? These weren't academic exercises anymore. They were existential necessities, and the urgency produced a remarkable burst of creativity and thought. In villas on the Aventine Hill, aristocratic families gathered for readings and discussions that went far beyond the usual polite literary exercises. They debated the nature of civilization itself. They read old texts with new eyes, searching for wisdom that might apply to their impossible situation. Virgil's Aeneid, that founding myth of Rome rising from Troy's ashes, took on new resonance. Maybe Rome too would fall, but give birth to something else. Maybe their role wasn't to preserve what existed, but to pass something essential forward. The poet Claudian, whose previous work had been conventional praise for emperors and generals, began writing with raw honesty. His verses caught the mood of the city, the mixture of pride and fear, the defiant assertion of Roman identity even as the foundations crumbled. He wrote about the daily acts of courage, the mother feeding her children on nothing, the merchant sharing his last supplies, the ordinary heroism of simply enduring. His work circulated in copies made by hand, passed from house to house, giving people language for what they felt. Christian writers were equally productive, but their output had a different character. They weren't interested in preserving Rome, but in explaining its fall within a theological framework. Augustine, though not yet in Rome, was beginning the work that would become the city of God, his massive attempt to show that earthly kingdoms rising and falling was part of a divine plan. In Rome itself, Jerome was translating the Bible into Latin, creating a text that would outlast the empire and define medieval Christianity. The work felt urgent because the old world was dying, and something needed to survive it. Artists worked with new intensity as well. Mosaicists created works of startling beauty, floor decorations for churches and wealthy homes that depicted paradise, peacocks and fountains and gardens untouched by hunger or fear. The contrast between the art and the streets outside where people starved made the work almost unbearably poignant. But that was precisely the point. In a world of scarcity and suffering, beauty became a form of resistance, a claim that human dignity persisted even in catastrophe. The preservation of texts became a kind of sacred duty. Families who owned libraries, the accumulated wisdom of centuries, understood that those books might be all that survived of Roman civilization. They organized copying projects, hired scribes to duplicate important works, sent copies to monasteries and churches in safer locations. It was a race against time and chaos, an attempt to rescue knowledge from the wreck of empire. Scholars debated which texts mattered most. Philosophy certainly, Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics who'd shaped Roman thought. History, so future generations would know what had been. Poetry, because it carried cultural memory in a form that could survive. Agricultural treatises, because practical knowledge might be the most valuable of all if civilization collapsed to subsistence. Legal texts, because Roman law was perhaps Rome's greatest achievement, a rational system for organizing human society that might be useful whenever order emerged again. The discussions had an elegiac quality, a sense of people consciously trying to choose what parts of themselves would outlive them. It was cultural triage on a civilizational scale, deciding what was essential versus merely nice to have. The process revealed what Romans truly valued when the decorative was stripped away and only the fundamental remained. Education, despite the crisis, or perhaps because of it, continued in modified form. Some wealthy families hired tutors to continue teaching their children, determined that the next generation would be literate and educated, even if they had to live in a changed world. Christian schools expanded, offering not just religious instruction but reading and writing and the classical curriculum that had always defined Roman education. The content might shift toward Christian texts, but the form, the idea that civilized people were educated people, persisted. Music took on new significance. Street musicians, usually background noise, attracted crowds now. Their songs ranged from defiant martial music asserting Roman strength to melancholic ballads about loss and change. A popular song that autumn had a refrain about stars still shining even when cities fell, a reminder that some things endured beyond human institutions. People sang it in taverns, in bathhouses, in their homes, finding comfort in shared melody. Philosophy, usually an elite pursuit, spread through the population as people grappled with questions of fate and fortune. Stoicism, with its emphasis on accepting what you couldn't control and focusing on virtue within your power, found new adherents. Why was this happening? Stoics said it didn't matter. What mattered was how you responded, with dignity or despair, with generosity or selfishness. The choice was yours even when circumstances weren't. Even fashion and personal presentation became forms of cultural statement. Some people dressed more carefully than ever, insisting on clean togas and proper appearance despite the hardships. It was a refusal to let crisis dictate identity, a claim that being Roman meant maintaining standards even when standards seemed pointless. Others adopted simpler dress, practical tunics without pretension, rejecting the old hierarchical markers as meaningless in a time of shared suffering. This cultural awakening wasn't universal. Many people were too hungry, too desperate, too focused on survival to engage in intellectual or artistic pursuits. But enough people did that it created a documented moment of remarkable creativity, a flowering on the edge of catastrophe. It was as if the city, knowing it was dying, wanted to distill everything it had learned, everything it valued, into a concentrated essence that might somehow survive the fall. The Renaissance was brief, burning bright through that autumn before exhaustion, and further crises overwhelmed it. But its products, the texts copied, the ideas debated, the art created, became part of what the Middle Ages inherited. Rome didn't just fall, it also taught, deliberately and urgently passing forward what it could to whoever came next. In late October, as the siege entered its third month, a realization spread through Rome that was more devastating than hunger. The eternal city wasn't eternal at all. It never had been. Eternity was a story Romans told themselves, a myth so old and so repeated that it had acquired the weight of truth. But myths don't fill stomachs. Myths don't stop barbarians. Myths don't preserve civilizations that have forgotten how to preserve themselves. The revelation wasn't intellectual. It was visceral, felt in the bones, understood in the gut. Rome could die, Rome was dying, and no amount of marble monuments or ancient lineage or cultural superiority would save it. This truth had been available all along, hiding in plain sight. Rome itself was built on the ruins of earlier civilizations. The Etruscans had ruled Italy before Rome existed, and where were they now? Carthage had been a great power, and Rome had destroyed it so completely that the very ground was sown with salt. The Greeks had achieved heights of culture Rome never matched, and they'd become provinces. Egypt, Persia, Babylon, all the mighty kingdoms of the past had risen and fallen. Why should Rome be different? But Romans had convinced themselves they were different. They had a special destiny. The gods favoured them. Their virtue and discipline set them apart. Their system of law and governance was universal and permanent. These weren't just beliefs, they were the foundation of Roman identity. To be Roman was to be part of something eternal, something that transcended individual mortality and gave meaning to individual lives. You might die, but Rome would live forever, and your contribution to Rome's glory would echo through the ages. Now that certainty dissolved, and what replaced it was terrifying. If Rome could fall, then nothing was certain. All the sacrifices made in Rome's name, all the wars fought and the wealth accumulated and the lives spent, might be for nothing. The whole grand project of empire might be just another temporary arrangement, no more permanent than morning mist. The psychological impact was devastating, like losing faith in gravity, like discovering that the ground beneath your feet had always been an illusion. Some people broke under the weight of this realization. They'd organized their entire understanding of reality around Rome's permanence. Without that anchor, they drifted into despair or madness. Others experienced it as liberation, the old lies falling away to reveal a more honest, if harder, truth. If Rome wasn't eternal, then maybe they owed it less than they'd believed. Maybe they could imagine alternatives. Maybe the future didn't have to be a pale copy of the past. The Christians had an explanation ready. The city of man was always temporary. Only the city of God was eternal. Earthly kingdoms rose and fell according to divine plan, and their fall wasn't tragedy but revelation, showing where true security lay. This framework helped many people make sense of catastrophe, gave them a story that explained suffering without requiring them to believe in Rome's special status. Rome was being judged and found wanting, but individuals could still find salvation. The pagans struggled more. If the gods weren't protecting Rome, were the gods powerless or indifferent? Had Rome somehow offended them? Or were the Christians right that the old gods were false, mere wood and stone without real power? These questions shook the foundations of traditional Roman religion, forcing confrontations with doubts that had been suppressed for generations. The deeper truth, though, went beyond religion or politics to something more fundamental about human civilization itself. Rome's fall revealed that complexity was fragile. The more interconnected a system became, the more dependent on trade and specialization and distant resources, the more vulnerable it was to disruption. Rome had built a civilization that required grain from Egypt, soldiers from Germania, gold from Spain, administration from Italy, all pieces working together in a vast machine. When one piece failed, everything failed. The simpler societies that surrounded Rome, the barbarian tribes, were less sophisticated but more resilient. They grew their own food, made their own weapons, governed themselves directly. They could lose a battle and survive. Rome, for all its grandeur, was like a magnificent building with termites in the foundation. It looked solid until you tested the beams and discovered they'd been hollowed out from within. This revelation had profound implications for how people thought about civilization itself. Maybe the goal wasn't to build ever larger, ever more complex systems. Maybe there was wisdom in staying small, in maintaining self-sufficiency, in not becoming too dependent on things you couldn't control. These weren't ideas Rome could have entertained in its prime, when expansion and interconnection seemed like obvious goods, but in collapse, they made sense. The military revelation was equally stark. Rome's army, once the finest fighting force in the world, couldn't save the city. Not because it lacked courage or skill, but because it was scattered across an empire too large to defend. The barbarians inside the gates, the federates and settlers who'd been integrated into Roman society, were as Roman as anyone by culture and habit. But their loyalty was negotiable, dependent on Rome's ability to deliver on its promises. When Rome couldn't pay its soldiers, couldn't maintain its roads, couldn't guarantee security, why should they fight for it? Power, it turned out, wasn't something you possessed. It was something granted by those you claimed to rule, and it could be withdrawn. The emperor had power only as long as the army accepted his authority. The Senate had power only as long as people cared about its opinions. Rome had power only as long as the provinces cooperated. That cooperation was ending, not through dramatic rebellion, but through quiet withdrawal. People simply opting out of a system that no longer served them. The economic truth was simpler, but no less devastating. Rome consumed more than it produced. It had been doing so for centuries, living off the accumulated wealth of conquest and the tribute of provinces. But conquest had stopped, and the provinces were exhausted. The pyramid scheme of her empire, where new conquests paid for old expenses, had run out of new territory to conquer. Now the bill was coming due, and there was nothing left to pay it with. Perhaps the deepest revelation was about identity itself. What did it mean to be Roman when Rome no longer worked? Could you carry Roman identity into a post-Roman world? Or was being Roman inseparable from empire, citizenship, the complex web of institutions that were now dissolving? These questions would occupy the next several generations as people tried to figure out who they were in the wreckage of what they'd been. The eternal city was mortal. That was the truth. Everything else was commentary. 2,000 years separate us from that autumn in Rome, but the distance is smaller than we imagine. We live in our own eternal city, whatever form it takes. A nation we assume will always exist. An economy we believe will always function. Systems of law and order we take for granted. We wake up expecting water from our taps, food in our stores, electricity in our walls. We assume tomorrow will be much like today, that the complex machinery keeping civilization running will continue running because it always has. We are Romans, comfortable in our marble halls, not yet aware that the grain ships might stop coming. The patterns that destroyed Rome are not unique to Rome. They appear throughout history, in every civilization that grew too complex, too dependent, too confident in its own permanence. The warning signs are always similar. Infrastructure deteriorating while monuments are built. Inequality widening while the wealthy retreat into private luxury. Military overextension draining resources from domestic needs. Political paralysis as institutions designed for one era struggle to address problems of another. Public trust eroding as the gap widens between official narratives and lived reality. We see these patterns and tell ourselves we're different. We've learned from history. We have technologies and systems Romans never imagined. This is true, but it's also what every civilization tells itself. The Romans had technologies and systems the Greeks never imagined. They also fell. Technology doesn't exempt us from the fundamental dynamics of complex systems. It just changes the speed and scale at which those dynamics operate. The siege of Rome teaches us that collapse isn't usually dramatic. It's not barbarians pouring through breached walls, though that image makes for better stories. It's the grain ships that stop coming. It's the aqueduct that develops leaks no one repairs. It's the slow accumulation of small failures that individually seem manageable but collectively become catastrophic. It's the moment when everyone realizes simultaneously that the emperor has no clothes, that the eternal city is mortal, that all the promises were just promises. We should pay attention to the cracks in our own foundations, not with panic but with honest assessment. What systems do we depend on that we don't fully understand? What supply chains would starve us if they broke? What institutions are we trusting to solve problems they may not be equipped to handle? These aren't questions designed to induce fear. They're questions designed to induce preparedness, resilience, the kind of unglamorous work that prevents crises rather than responding to them. The human element is what makes the Roman story so relevant. Marcus the baker, Gaius the senator, Helena the slave. They weren't abstractions or statistics. They were people trying to navigate impossible circumstances with imperfect information and limited options. They made choices we might judge harshly from our comfortable distance, hoarding when they should have shared, fleeing when they should have stayed, despairing when they should have hoped. But they were doing their best in a collapsing world, and we would likely do no better in their place. What the story reveals is how quickly social bonds can fray under pressure. Neighbours turn on neighbours, communities fragment, trust evaporates. The cooperative behaviours that make civilization possible become casualties of scarcity and fear. This is perhaps the most important lesson, that preserving civilization isn't primarily about preserving buildings or institutions. It's about preserving the social trust and mutual obligation that make cooperation possible. Once that dissolves, everything else follows. Yet the story also shows remarkable resilience and creativity. The cultural awakening as Rome fell, the urgent attempts to preserve knowledge, the philosophical grappling with fundamental questions, these weren't failures, they were humanity at its best. People facing catastrophe still chose to think, to create, to pass something forward. They couldn't save their civilization, but they saved ideas and texts and values that would shape the next 1,000 years. The Renaissance didn't begin in the 15th century, it began in the 5th, with Romans trying to rescue what mattered from the wreck. This suggests a different way of thinking about collapse and continuation. Civilizations don't simply end, they transform. Elements persist even as the overall structure changes. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Rome adopted Roman law, spoke Latin-derived languages, converted to Roman Christianity, and maintained what they could of Roman administration. The fall wasn't an ending, but a metamorphosis. Painful and destructive, but not total. Something always survives to feed the next iteration. For us, this means taking seriously both the fragility of our systems and the resilience of human culture. Yes, civilizations fall. Yes, the institutions we depend on can fail. But ideas persist. Knowledge accumulates. Each generation builds on what the previous one preserved, even if the building looks different than anyone expected. Our job isn't to make our civilization eternal, an impossible task, but to make it good while it lasts, and to pass forward what's valuable to whoever comes next. The Romans under siege had to decide what mattered most, what was worth preserving at cost. We face a similar task, though, hopefully with more time and less desperation. What do we value enough to defend? What would we want to survive if our civilization transformed into something else? These aren't academic questions, they're existential ones, forcing us to distinguish between the essential and the merely customary, between what truly matters and what we've just grown accustomed to. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about humility. The Romans believed they were eternal and discovered they weren't. We believe many things about our own permanence, our own exceptionalism, our own immunity to the forces that toppled previous civilizations. History suggests we're probably wrong. Not about everything, but about enough that humility is warranted. We should hold our certainties more lightly, our assumptions more tentatively, our grand narratives more skeptically. This doesn't mean despair or nihilism. It means realism married to hope. Yes, our systems are fragile. Yes, our civilization will eventually change in ways we can't predict or control. But humans are remarkably adaptable, and culture is remarkably persistent. We've survived ice ages and plagues and wars and collapses before. We'll survive whatever comes next, though perhaps not in the form we currently inhabit. The baker, the senator, and the slave all faced an uncertain future. Some of their choices helped them survive. Some didn't. But they all chose, and their choices mattered, if not to the empire, then to themselves and their families. We face our own uncertain future, our own slow accumulation of cracks in the foundation. Like them, we can choose how to respond, with generosity or selfishness, with wisdom or foolishness, with eyes open or eyes closed. The eternal city was mortal. So is ours. What we do with that knowledge is up to us. Walk through Rome today, and you walk through layers of time collapsed into a single space. The forum where senators debated is still there, columns standing against the sky like broken teeth, their marble weathered but enduring. The Colosseum, where crowds roared for blood and spectacle, hosts tourists instead of gladiators, its arches framing the modern city beyond. The Pantheon, that architectural marvel with its impossible dome, functions now as a church, Christian prayers echoing where pagan rites once pleased the gods. The stones remember everything and nothing, mute witnesses to 2,000 years of transformation. The apartment blocks where Marcus the baker lived are long gone, burned or collapsed or simply demolished and built over again and again until no trace remains. The insulae couldn't last. They were never meant to. But the pattern persists. Rome is still a city of ordinary people living in cramped spaces, still a city where the magnificent and the mundane exist side by side. The emperor's palaces survive as ruins. The people's homes survive as principles. The same human needs creating similar solutions across the centuries. The aqueducts that fed the city still. march across the landscape, their arches striding through fields and modern suburbs, carrying nothing now but memory and admiration. Some were repaired in later centuries, maintained because the need for water transcends empires. Others stand empty, monuments to engineering that outlasted the civilization that built it. The water still flows in Rome, but through different pipes, different systems, proving that function persists even when form changes. In museums throughout the city, the artifacts of daily life rest behind glass. The oil lamps and cooking pots, the children's toys and lovers' gifts, the shopping lists and angry graffiti. They're curated now, labelled and explained, transformed from trash into treasures by the passage of time. Visitors look at them and try to imagine the hands that held them, the lives that used them. The connection is tenuous but real, mediated by glass and time, but still a connection, present to past, mortal to mortal. The words survive better than the stones in some ways. Virgil is still read. Cicero is still quoted. The histories and philosophies and poems that Romans wrote continue to shape how we think, how we argue, how we understand ourselves. Latin is dead as a spoken language but alive in every Romance tongue, in half the English vocabulary, in the terminology of law and medicine and science. The language transformed but didn't die, scattering itself across Europe and beyond, seeds from a fallen tree growing into new forests. The ideas persist most powerfully of all. Roman law forms the basis of legal systems across the world. The concept of citizenship, of rights and responsibilities that transcend tribal or ethnic identity, is Roman in origin. The architectural vocabulary of domes and arches, of public spaces designed for civic life, comes from Rome. The very idea of roads connecting distant places into a unified system is Roman. We live in a world Rome helped create, even when we don't recognize its influence. But perhaps the most important legacy is the story itself, the narrative of rise and fall that Rome gave to Western civilization. Every empire since has measured itself against Rome, seeing in its trajectory a warning or a model or both. Every decline invokes Roman parallels, every crisis prompts comparisons to Rome's fall. We can't think about civilization without thinking about Rome, can't contemplate our own futures without reference to Rome's past. The city may have fallen, but it won the long game of memory. The people, though, are truly gone. Marcus and Gaius and Helena, if they even existed, left no individual trace. We don't know their names, can't read their thoughts, can't know how their stories ended. They're part of the great anonymous mass of humanity that lives and dies and leaves no record except the cumulative weight of their existence. But they were real. They woke up on that autumn morning in 409. They worried and hoped and struggled and endured. They were our ancestors in spirit, if not in blood, and their lives had dignity even if they left no monuments. The siege itself ended, though not with dramatic resolution. Alaric's forces eventually entered Rome in late August of 410, not through military assault but through betrayal. Someone opened the gates from inside. The sack that followed was terrible but brief. 3 days of looting and destruction before Alaric withdrew, his point made, his demands partially met. Rome survived, diminished but standing. The eternal city proved mortal but stubborn, dying slowly rather than all at once. The Western Empire lingered for another 66 years before the final emperor was deposed. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, continued for another 1,000 years, calling itself Roman until the very end. The fall wasn't a single event but a long process, a civilization slowly transforming into something else. New forms emerging from old materials like sculpture revealed from stone. And here we are, 2,000 years later, still thinking about Rome, still learning from its example, still walking its streets and reading its words and pondering its lessons. The eternal city died, but memory is its own kind of eternity. As long as humans tell stories about the past, Rome will live in those stories, a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a reminder of what we can build and what we can lose. The sun sets over Rome tonight as it did 2,000 years ago, painting the ruins gold and casting long shadows across the Forum. Tourists take photographs, locals hurry home. The city lives its modern life, utterly changed and somehow the same. The bakers' ovens are cold forever, but bread is still baked. The senators' debates are long forgotten, but politics continues. The slave's chains are broken, but her struggles echo in every fight for dignity and freedom. The eternal city was never eternal, but it was real, and reality leaves traces that time cannot entirely erase. In stone and memory, in language and law, in the persistence of human nature across the centuries, Rome endures. Not as it was, but as it became, scattered seeds growing into forests its builders never imagined. The story of that autumn day, of ordinary people facing impossible circumstances, reminds us that history isn't just about emperors and empires. It's about bread and water and shelter and hope. It's about waking up each morning and choosing to continue. It's about the quiet heroism of simply being human when being human is hard. Rome fell. But humanity continued, and that perhaps is the real legacy. Not the marble monuments, but the stubborn persistence of people who keep waking up, keep trying, keep building, keep hoping, even when empires crumble and certainties dissolve and the eternal reveals itself as temporary. The stones remember, and so do we.